Okay, welcome everybody to another OASIS lunchtime talk. Apologies for the delay for everybody online and here in OASIS. Today we have an interesting talk about using game jamming as a teaching tool in higher education, I think it was.
Yep.
And specific focus on analog games in game jams. And here to give the talk we have Joe Macleod-Iredale, representing both University of Salford and Manchester Metropolitan University.
Yep.
So without further ado, take it away, Joe.
Yep. Haven't done anything yet. So this presentation, it began life as a poster for like a higher education art and design learning conference, which is why it looks nice, because I was intimidated by all the graphic design teachers. But I have made it a little bit Finnish up in the top corner there. So just to introduce myself, Joe Macleod-Iredale. Impressive rendition of my name there. People usually get it wrong and I'm not offended by it, but I think probably a lot of Finns will be familiar with that. I used to be a furniture designer. I ran a sort of consultancy for 10 years until COVID killed that. Whilst I was at the latter stages of doing that, I started teaching. So I currently teach on the Salford Art and Design Foundation. For people who aren't familiar with the British system, foundation degree is you do it prior to your bachelor's degree. If you're not sure what you want to do or you haven't achieved the academic standard to get straight on. I also teach on the product design course at Manchester Met, but this research is part of my NWC DTP funded doctoral research. I am hopefully handing in back end of the summer. I've told lots of people that, and hopefully that'll make it happen. So this research project, my whole PhD, was inspired by a third-year design bachelor, design BA module that I ran, and essentially it was a dry academic theory module, and we were concerned that the students would all detach from it and they wouldn't engage, they wouldn't give it the time that needed to, so we got them to make games, and it worked so well that they completely neglected the other module they were supposed to be doing at the same time. So I think I'm going to call that success. So what we sort of accidentally achieved, as well as quite an engaging module, is we accidentally taught the students iteration and we taught them peer feedback in a way that I haven't really seen elsewhere in design education. So the core of my research is a series of game jams, which I will explain shortly. So, the issues that I kind of identified with design, higher education, but this sort of applies more widely into more sort of creative fields, is a lot of the projects are fairly poor analogues for commercial projects. And coming from the kind of red in tooth and claw end of the private sector, I'm very familiar with exactly how these commercial projects work. So this is a way of potentially giving students a better version of that. As everybody here who teaches is probably aware, students will generally, they'll have a few ideas and then they'll pick the best and then pursue them to the bitter end. There's very little space for sort of iterative improvement. Like we as teachers, we do our best with that sometimes, but quite often what they want to do is they want the shiniest, most professional looking end result rather than something that necessarily actually works. And as a result, that's sort of as a result of just the assessment at the end of the process. So anybody who's been in sort of commercial practice, there's a constant conversation with the client, which is kind of difficult to ape within an academic setting. And frequently, the less confident students, I find, are very reticent to share their work with their peers because everybody in the room has an opinion and has useful things to contribute to a student's work. But other than the loudest, most confident ones, then quite often people are just really quiet. So, as with anybody who's done a PhD, I have, having sort of finished my third year now, I've settled on my research question. So we kind of, obviously I had stuff right at the start. So the actual research question is, what are the consequences of embedding analog game making in higher education for engagement, collegiality and preparedness for the creative industries? There's a whole bunch of sort of little sub-clauses within there, but they just essentially support that question. So if people are interested later, then I can talk to you about those, but I think it would be boring if I read them all out. So I suspect this room has a much higher proportion of people who are familiar with what a game jam is than usual, but I'll just run through it. So a game jam, people generally make a game from scratch. Yeah, it's not generally seen as an environment where you bring something that you're working on and then you make it better. They're generally pretty intensive. They don't really work if people are doing a lot of other things at the same time. They tend to be 1 day to 1 week. There are some examples that are longer than that. I approached Guinness World Records because I'm going to try and do the shortest organised game jam ever at a conference in the summer, but apparently they're not taking applications for that, which is a shame because that would be entertaining to have. Fairly fundamentally, and again with all of these there are exceptions, it's not a competitive environment. Yeah, so nobody wins a game jam. Some have got awards for the best X, Y or Z, but fundamentally it's a kind of a supportive environment rather than a competitive one. Frequently they're done in groups. Like the Global Game Jam, I think the average number of participants in a group was about 5. There are other ones with different sizes of groups. Predominantly they're digital, so our tech apprentice, I'm going to call you because the tech wizard you needed to phone up, you were saying that you took part in a game jam and everybody else was digital and you were the only analog person. So the Global Game Jam, I think it's about 3% analog games, which I feel is a bit of an issue really. So what is analog? Instinctively we'll know what that means. When I came to write the definition of it, in my definition of terms, it got a bit complicated because I'm not like doing like poker tables, I'm not doing arm wrestling. Yeah, it's kind of awkward how to define it, but essentially if you think board games, card games, nothing with a sort of a digital element to it. So why have I chosen analog? The absolute key part of it is I'm not teaching game design students, I'm not teaching coders, I'm not teaching people who I can expect to have expertise in using a computer program. So unless I were to use something like Scratch, which I'm not an expert on, then I'd really kind of struggle to get a general audience involved. Whereas with an analog game, everybody knows how a dice works. Yep, everybody can kind of move things around on a table. Anybody can kind of grab random things and then use them as game pieces. So you have an incredibly fast sort of idea to playtest time. So with a digital game, I don't know, I can imagine somebody who really, really knows what they're doing being able to get something in front of people in a day, but I could, like, as a game jammer in an analog way, you can pretty much, I don't know, have an idea and start playing it and see what happens. You can fix things whilst you're playtesting. So the amount of times that when I've been kind of making games with people, you cross something out on a card or you just go, oh, that was a bit cheap, make that cost more. Yeah, there's no coding involved. Well, I suppose there's physical coding. And just sort of instinctively, they're sort of more naturally a group experience because most people's experience of analog games is started off as a family thing. And whilst there's a good number of solo analog games, it's predominantly a kind of cooperative thing. And obviously we don't have any sort of requirement for technology. So I can run a game jam with a handful of dice and some post-it notes and pens. Yeah, I don't need tech to be provided. I don't really need data to be provided. So the way in which I've run my game designs in order to kind of get the things out of them that I want is, this is where this kind of game board comes in at the top here. You can see the Moomin wandering along there. So we start off with just a settling in period. Yep, people have got to kind of get used to each other. kind of get settled, wait for the people that show up late, followed by a briefing where I explain some of the things I've already explained, where I explain some of the purposes of the research, and then we get people to form teams. There's all sorts of complicated literature about how best to form teams, but and the literature suggests it's better that the teacher constructs the teams, but the level of resistance, if anybody's tried to do this, would be massive, so I just let people work with their friends. Yep. So once I've briefed the people and I've given them a prompt, yep, so the game jam sort of stops people doing pre-work and pre-thinking about these things by providing a prompt for people to respond to. So the prompt that I went for was bugs. The reason I've chosen that is largely because it's a very easy one to get into. It's very relatable. Everybody can picture it immediately, but it's got quite a lot of scope for people to kind of take in any direction they want. So I've had students do things about insects. I've also had students do things about kind of bug out bags and fleeing civilization, one about spying, all sorts of different sort of aspects of it. I haven't had anybody do any sort of computer code or anything like that, but those things are all sort of available if people want it. So as we kind of continue on, we can sort of see these loops here as sort of like half-day-ish time periods. So once we've had, it's probably a good couple of hours, then we get to the point where people pitch their ideas to the group. Is everything okay? Yep, you just looked a bit concerned. So rather than people just disappearing off and getting on with stuff themselves, what I want is for people as groups to kind of go, oh, this is our idea, and then everybody else can feed into it, because quite often somebody will go, oh yeah, I know a game like that, oh, that's a brilliant idea. And not just like the practical suggestions, I've found it really helpful sort of motivation-wise when the rest of the room is being all supportive. So once we've kind of gone through that feedback process, we actually I get the students to sort of run off and actually start making the games. Yep. So I don't want anything beautiful. I don't want anything that people have really, really thought through. So essentially by sort of late on in the first day, I'm wanting people with something that people can play. Yep. Totally happy if it's completely broken. I try and get people to focus on kind of a core game loop, because I've had participants who've become obsessed with world building and story creation, and it's just fascinating. You've got this, they thought up names for half a dozen gods and all of their traits, but they didn't actually have any game mechanics at all. So I think in hindsight, I probably should have gone, yeah, just do a Dungeons and Dragons source book. That'll do the job fine. So by the end of that sort of period of time, everybody playtests each other's games. Obviously, the practicalities of that depend on how many participants, but generally the teams are 4-ish. It varies wildly depending on if somebody doesn't come back after lunch or if somebody shows up late. But I try and kind of mix all of the people around, so there's representatives of each group testing each game, and then I try and force them to give feedback at the end. So I encourage them to like, oh, what did you think of that? What do you think could be improved? But most of the feedback actually happens throughout the playing. So whilst the people who've designed the game are explaining it, they're kind of working things out in their head. And if they encounter something in the game, which is really frequent at this point, where, oh, we haven't worked out what to do there, then everybody talks about it. Because one of the fundamental things about games is people are wanting to do this. If I got my students to design a table, it would take them an incredibly long time to build the table, and then everybody would be a bit cautious about giving feedback because you couldn't change it there and then. So then we run that sort of cycle of working on the game, incorporating those changes, sort of a couple more times, and then at the end of the final day, most of the ones I've run have been over 2 full days, because I want to be able to fit in as many of these cycles as possible. quite often I get other members of staff or like my old students to come in and play the games to give it a bit of a fresh perspective, because by this point everybody's kind of familiar with one another's games. So is there anything I haven't covered here? Right, so one thing that I found quite important was running the game jams kind of in a big open space where everybody can see what each other are up to, rather than people disappearing off into little individual study rooms, because it's quite important to have that energy, but also for people to be able to look over and go, oh, they're using that component for that and stuff like that. That sort of, there needs to be a sort of a momentum which doesn't quite work when people are all dispersed. Equipment-wise, standard things that are available in any classroom. I've got a couple of those boxes that builders use to store sort of screws and things like that, full of dice and meeples and all sorts of things like that, but I'm not supplying anything super complicated. I haven't got a massive sort of setup expense or anything like that. I think to buy all of the pieces that I've got, including the boxes, was sort of less than €200, so I'm trying to keep the barrier to entry quite small. Oops, sorry, ignore that at the top. This is a deliberate mistake. Right, so if I were just running this as a teacher, then that previous slide would cover things, but as I'm running as a researcher, which I talked about this at a conference and somebody said, you're an idiot trying to both gather data and facilitate, and I agree. So I'm trying to collect possibly a bit much data on this, but when I was running through this, I didn't really know what would be valuable and what wouldn't be quite so valuable. So when we're starting off, and obviously people complete a participant information sheet, they need to do some kind of consent documents, all of that kind of thing, and then I get them to fill in a pre-jam survey which collects demographic information. I'm also collecting things like sort of, I'll show you the stuff later on, but to try and understand who the people being involved are. But the heart of it is there's 5 card sort exercises where I present a bunch of statements. I'll talk about that a bit more. So the pre-jam survey in a minute. So the pre-jam survey collects a great deal of data, and then as we're kind of continuing on through this process, I'm taking written observations, I'm taking photographs of the work in progress, and then I was taking kind of snapshots of what do people feel at any given time, but that was disruptive, so I stopped doing that. And then at the end of each day that I'm delivering this, I'm writing a reflection, which I originally intended to publish in my appendices, but it turned out it was a place where I could get some things off my chest. So I was writing things that I didn't want the participants to read sometimes because I was irritated with them and stuff like that. So yeah, that's useful, but it's not finding its way into appendices. And then when I get right to the end, obviously observations and photographs throughout, then what I'm kind of culminating with is I write a sort of like my feelings about the game, like a sort of reflective description of the different games and the process that they went through. And it's been incredibly valuable to record all of those things at the time, because obviously as time passes you forget little bits and pieces and you don't totally understand what that particular photograph was of. But yes, as I mentioned, I've got rather too much data because I'm trying to mix between qualitative and quantitative, which I will kind of talk through when I get to some results. So this is sort of like my demographic stuff here. So unusually in game jams, very unusually in game jams, I've got pretty much a bang-on even split between male and female participants, and a significant overrepresentation relative to the population of like non-binary participants, which I suspect I can't kind of infer anything massively from, because maybe I'm just looking, the population that I'm drawing from is more than 50% female, but the general game jam is sort of 20-odd% female, and a lot of them don't record non-binary participants. Participants from foundation degree, which is below bachelor's level, So if you add up all 3 years of undergraduates, I've got a remarkably kind of even split between pre-bachelors, bachelors and postgrad participants, because one of the things that I was hoping to find out was sort of where this fit best within the academic experience. I'm not sure that I've quite got the data at the moment to sort of prove that. So asking people roughly how many card games and board games people have got at home as a metric of how keen a player they were, because obviously you're going to get a very different experience from somebody like Asa, whose whole life rotates around playing particular games, than somebody who like played Monopoly when they were a kid and hasn't touched it since. So most people sort of 1 to 4 space there, though when you can't take this as how many games are actually in people's houses, because when I asked my wife and my elder daughter how many games we had, they both said 20 something, and I started counting them and I stopped bothering at 50. So more significant metric is possibly how often do people play board games. So you can see that it's mostly once or twice a year, every month or two, so we're not mainly talking about really experienced gamers. Obviously there's some people that play really significantly a lot more often than that, but I think it's important to note that my cohort is not gamers in nearly the same way as if we delivered it to the people in this room. So I got people to mention the 3 games that they really enjoyed. I didn't want to say favourite games, and just was appalled that Monopoly was the most popular. We've got work to do, people. I think we need to Uno second. That's all right. But it was really fascinating that very few of the games that were mentioned more than once had been invented this century. So Cards Against Humanity is like really the only significant one there. There's obviously a whole bunch of games that were only mentioned once, but the table becomes unmanageable at that point. So again, sort of demonstrating these aren't hobby gamers. Nobody's mentioning Blood on the Clock Tower or Blades in the Dark or anything like that. So I think I've kind of painted the group that I'm working with. So over the course of about 18 months, I ran 6 jams. I was hoping to run more, but they're quite difficult. If you need a couple of days of time in somebody's timetable, then it's quite difficult to achieve. So my students at Salford for 2 years on the foundation degree. Also ran it twice with the product design students, but they weren't familiar with me at that point because I hadn't started teaching on that. Also ran one with the MMU RISE program, which is sort of a curriculum enhancement project that kind of sits alongside people's degrees and sort of they can earn points with it. Apparently it's based on Zelda, which I think is a really interesting kind of side quest mechanic. And then I ran it for the general design master's students. So overall 55 participants and 20 games produced. There were also 2 not games produced, like the people that just kind of made a world. But it's all interesting data, isn't it? So, Salford one. This was fairly well attended. I had 12 participants on the first day. One of them got ill, so didn't come back the following day. We had a fascinating, not quite a game, but an interesting storytelling experience. For the first one here, based on kind of bookworms and the idea that it was kind of creating stories. A much more traditional game based on a spider's web, which had a mechanic of sort of spiraling round or going in and out, which I haven't seen anywhere else. And then what happens if you crash a sort of card fighting game called Dungeon Mayhem with Risk, but make it bugs on somebody's house. That group stayed incredibly late both days, and I kind of had to kick them out. So this was like really high energy and very chaotic, but that's kind of what that cohort were like anyway. I'm glad I brought some water. So I probably should have mentioned at the start, please, I'm sure we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. But if anything's sort of unclear and I haven't explained anything right, then please get my attention and I can clarify things. So the MMU one, we had 15 students the first day, and on the second day, because of work commitments and things like that from some of the students, we just had 13. First game here, it was all, I think it was heavily sort of COVID inspired. And it looks like an incredibly simple chase game, but there was, fascinatingly, if anybody's familiar with sort of Werewolf or Secret Hitler, they kind of invented that game because neither of them had played it before, but they made one of the players secretly somebody else. That was pretty interesting. The most photogenic game produced obviously by a product design student, which was about kind of capturing counters in this incredibly painful to fall on game board inspired by a spider's web. We've got essentially top trumps about bugs, and then the one at the end it was inspired by, do you guys have Ray Mears or Bear Grylls over here? Sort of, it's kind of escaping from an island with sort of natural resources and things, and that, I don't think it worked as a game, but they really enjoyed playing it. Here we've got the one with various design students. This game was a really kind of labour of love by some illustration students who I'm really gutted that they didn't have time to make it pretty. But it's like a cabinet of curiosities where you're playing as a bug and you acquire traits from different bugs. So if you can acquire blood sucking from the mosquito and things like that, and you're trying to escape from the cabinet. This second one here, sort of not a game. Interestingly, I don't think they quite got it. I tried to help them. They were all really quiet, like quieter than Finnish people. And they made something that really looked like a game. We were quite resistant to being helped. The next game was sort of fleeing from a disaster in a city. This was one of the ones inspired by the sort of bug out idea. And one of the participants completely took over to the point where the people that he worked with, so I had to run this one over 3 half days. He worked with somebody on the first day and they didn't come back for the second day, and he worked with somebody else on the second day and they didn't. So on this one, I had appalling attrition. I had 15 people on the first day, which I was really keen on, and then I got 6 and then I got 5. And it's sort of timetabling issues, but I would strongly suggest, because these were subsequent Thursdays, if anybody's running game jams, put them really close together because that momentum is really vital. But the people that did come back really, really meant it. Again, we've got some another set at Salford. So we've got a consciously this time Secret Hitler werewolf thing involving like trading items that you need to survive on an island, which is kind of one of the more resolved games that we got, and it seemed to be able to cope with lots and lots of people, and people are enjoying being horrible to each other. The game in the middle, he doesn't actually have 4 fingers, one of them's just hiding, but he looks like an alien there. This was the one where they built the world, but not actually the game, despite me kind of repeatedly kind of encouraging them in that direction. And because they're my students, like I know that one of them's statemented she's autistic, so I'm kind of, it's consistent with how she acts in class. You can't really tell her what to do. Like very creative, but completely unbiddable. And then the final game, which was unfortunately one of the people who ended up participating solo because the rest of her friend who she was going to team up with wasn't able to come, was inspired by her, when she was younger, one of her cousin's tarantulas escaped, and all the relatives were ordered to kind of go round and find it. So it's inspired by looking around a house, desperately trying not to find the thing you're looking for. And it ended up, yeah, they worked really well, but she's a very diligent student, so I'm sort of not surprised. So the Rise one, unfortunately, wasn't all that well attended. I had one student who was very, very much kind of the extreme end of the kind of hobby gamer, who didn't want to be given feedback, but kind of built something where you were trying to escape from prison that involved all sorts of complex dice rolls. And the way that they differed from most of the other participants is most of the time they spent testing it themselves, which I've found quite fascinating. The other two, who were both accountancy students who hardly played games at all, needed a lot more instruction, because I think essentially if left to their own devices they would have just made Snakes and Ladders. But they really, really enjoyed the drawing and the colouring in and things like that. And their game was involving clearing parasites off snails, and the best bit of their game was they made all of these sort of challenges and questions, and then we played the game, but they didn't make nearly enough challenges and questions, so we had about 10 and 4 people were playing it, so we cycled through these things loads of times, which became totally ridiculous. Final game jam. These are the 2 most resolved games, but that's not really a massive shock because they're product design students. I only had 3 then 2 participants on this one, so I didn't get them to work in groups because the feedback loop mechanism was more important than getting them to work as a team. This was a really fascinating party game that involved balancing these dominoes on different parts of your body, and if they fell off, then you got a peg put on that part of your body, which really actually hurt. But it worked really well as a party game because people quite liked inflicting pain on one another. And the other game, which just iterated wonderfully, so we tested it and tested it and tested it, and this is probably about version 7 or 8, was about bug spraying bugs to death that land on your picnic by throwing shapes on there. He never quite addressed the I don't want bug spray all over my food, but that's absolutely fine. So yeah, no, that one worked remarkably well. So the problems that I encountered, you realise he's got no idea how much time's gone. I had 3 or 4 jams that fell through that weren't able to be scheduled. I was supposed to be delivering one to entrepreneurship students in a business school in Germany, but that didn't end up happening. I was hoping to deliver one into high school, but my supervisors sort of said, "You've got enough, stop trying to make it bigger." So scheduling congestion, like anybody who teaches knows that it's hard work getting stuff involved. Recruitment stress, every time I was terrified that not enough people would show up. And obviously it happened a couple of times where you kind of, your heart sinks when I had one person show up on time for one of them, and that was a bit terrifying. Like I mentioned before, the conflict between data collection and facilitation, wouldn't recommend, but obviously I'd need 2 of me for that. The attendance attrition, that was only a significant problem in one of the places, but that's okay. And then the volume and the complexity of data. But hopefully I've managed to kind of find useful things to do with the data. So those card sort exercises that I mentioned before, and this is something that as soon as I finish, I'm hoping to publish this method. And if anybody wants to talk about this as a way of assessing attitude change before and after an event, it seems to work quite well, and I couldn't find anything that anybody else had done that kind of did the job. So essentially, this is the question: sort these. So whose opinion of your design work is most important? So ask them to sort these in terms of importance before, ask them afterwards, after the event, go through some absolute Excel hell, and then you can kind of aggregate all of these things into some data that I'm going to show people in a minute. But it seems to work quite well. So I'll just shoot through these because they're a little bit difficult to interpret. But what you're looking at here is the average position across all of the participants before the event and after the event. So in this one, we can see, if you see them kind of going apart, yeah, that suggests, so if everybody just randomly put things, everything would be down the middle because the average would be in the middle. If everybody completely agreed, you'd see straight lines at the category. So as people agree more, then they diverge. So what I've done with the whose opinion in your design work is most important is I think I've taught them something, yeah, because they now agree more than they did previously. I don't know, so what I've done kind of, other than achieving that consensus, is they see the work as much more important for a designer. They just basically agreed on this one. Yep, largely consistent. I didn't manage to change many ideas, but you can see we've got time management going up a fair bit. We've got attention to detail kind of going down. Tenacity, don't use words that your students don't understand. And I got most of them to complete the surveys before they attended, and then I had quite a number of the people who completed it on the day going, what does tenacity mean? It's like, well, that data's going in the bin. But so yes, test more widely, and don't just test it with your daughter who's in top set English at school and your wife who's got a degree in English literature. Test more widely. So anybody here familiar with Stanford D School's design thinking method? Slightly, a little bit. So fundamentally, in like design education, it's sort of like the standard way of teaching it because it's fairly easy to understand. So ideate, really ugly word, coming up with ideas, empathize, understanding what the customer wants, define, which is specifying what you actually need, and then we've got testing, and we've got testing and we've got prototyping. Obviously prototyping comes before testing in the classical way. So significant, like having the people who put these down in the correct order from the textbook completely kind of stuffed the data here a little bit, because I think I had about 20% of people put them in the right order, but most things are consistent. The coming up with ideas, people see as significantly less important after doing the game jam, and they see testing as significantly more important, which students always put ideate at the top because it's the most fun. Yeah. So it's quite interesting. I'm sort of working my way through discussion chapters and tidying up my lit review at the moment, so I don't have final conclusions on all of this stuff. This one, what we can mainly see here, so this is what's the most important in making a game better. So we don't see very many things change order here. I'm not going to read all of these out. The only thing that doesn't kind of gain consistency and consensus is the include lots of cool components. I don't know what's going on there. If anybody has got any massive insights for that, but make the art beautiful drops absolutely plummets. Yeah, because design students, art students, obviously the aesthetics very important, but I'm forcing them to work with post-it notes and scribbled things and cross things out. And if anybody actually just started doing nice drawings, I'd tell them off. But yeah, and make the text really funny. Nobody really cared about that to start off with. How creative do you feel? One major thing, if you're ever doing something like this, don't give the opportunity for people to give 10 out of 10 at the start, because you don't give yourself, I should have been able to give them 11 afterwards. That's a better way of doing it. So if you see the MMU MA one, yep, I seem to have made them feel less creative, which is sort of against the grain, but that's the one with the really significant attrition. So I've decided to sort of ignore that. Because we're assessing 15 people at the start and 5, I think, at the end. But if we look at the mean there, we're seeing quite a significant upward trend. Yeah, so it would be interesting to run this with more students who don't see themselves as studying creative subjects, because if you're studying fine art and you don't define yourself as creative, then that's probably an issue. So, as well as that quantitative data, which I've just kind of talked through, if anybody's familiar with reflexive thematic analysis, you poor thing, have you had a fight with NVivo as well? So, I've got a horrible feeling I'm now kind of MMU's person who knows NVivo best, and I don't know it very well. So fundamentally, the way this works is a way of interrogating qualitative data in a way that's not just reading and seeing what pops out. So you establish code labels, which are what I'm kind of showing on this side. So those would be things like positive examples of teamwork, yeah? And then you run through absolutely everything, which takes almost forever, and you go, oh, that's somebody mentioning a positive thing about teamwork. Oh, that's a photograph of a card with something crossed out and something else put on there. So that'd be an example of kind of reuse without remaking, and that kind of thing. So when you've coded all of the data, so I had 90 different codes, and once I'd gone all the way through everything, I'd got nearly 1,500 references. So I went through all of the data that I gathered other than the quantitative stuff. And once you've got all of that stuff, then you can it gives things a weight in a way that you don't just have from reading things. And then the idea is that you then assemble these things and mix them around to let some themes emerge. Yeah, so it's not a scientific process. If you did this on my data, you might come up with quite different themes, but that's apparently not a problem, even though it kind of feels a bit wrong to me. So I ended up with 4.5 themes because I decided not to use one of those, and a bunch of codes that are dead orphans at the end there, which kind of hurt a bit because I did the work. So the emergent themes are working with others. So this is team formation, group dynamics, like working as a team versus working solo, that kind of thing. I've got quite a lot that speaks to that. So peer feedback was a significant part of the process. So not just giving and receiving it, but how this affected the making, how this affected the playtesting. Experiencing iteration. So like I was mentioning, this is absolutely core to what I want students to be able to take away with them. So it's about like putting that, like forcing people through that iterative cycle that's just totally normal from a commercial perspective, but quite unusual from a academic perspective. Practicalities of game making. So this is the bit that's going to go into my, if you want to run a analog game jam, do this stuff. And then I don't have a good name for this last one yet. I've called it effortless education. I've stumbled across the phrase heutagogic teaching, which is essentially the teaching of like self-motivated adults. But it's the idea that I'm not having to put effort in. They're sort of self-sustaining and they're doing the activity and they're doing it because they enjoy it and they're learning. Yeah? Yeah, I'll find a good way of explaining that over the next couple of months. So what I've got to do now before I get to Dr. Joe at the end, hopefully I'm going to be in Finland for another couple of weeks at this point, and I'm really hoping to go home with an untangled lit review, because I wrote the lit review year and a half, 2 years ago, and went down loads of rabbit holes, got all excited. I've got thousands and thousands of word history of history of the analog game environment. It doesn't need to be in there. Today's kind of taking the tiny bits of it I need and throwing the rest of it away, which sort of hurts, but I might publish it something else later. Finish my discussion chapters, obviously intro and conclusion, stuff like that. So I'm getting there, but I haven't totally finished everything yet. And then obviously, once I've got to that position, then hopefully I can publish all sorts of wonderful things that you guys will read and cite, and then I can be a proper grown-up academic. So, just before I finish, I have with me somewhere, it's on that table there, I've got a game that I have been told by a fellow academic who used to work at Kickstarter that I would be an idiot to put on Kickstarter before I finish my PhD. But I'm really keen to play it with as many people as would like to. So it's a really nasty game. If you're familiar with Jane Austen, with Bridgerton, it's set in that world, and the idea is you marry off your children for your own political advancement. You can kill other people's children in it. So it works it works equally well for people who are taking the game seriously as people who just want to role play and be bastards. And yep, it works. It needs 3 people. It's worked up to 9 if you've got a big enough table. So I'll have this with me at lunchtime, and I'm happy to play it. And I might send something over for ASA to circulate when it's gone live, in case anybody wants a copy of it. So fundamentally, yeah, it's exactly 1 o'clock. I'll have some applause just for that bit. Okay. So thank you for delaying. That's perfect. So yeah, any questions? If people need to run away, I'm sat in the, I don't know what the room's called. Okay, that one. If anybody needs to run off, but I could take questions now.
Okay, and we will use 10 to 15 minutes for questions because we started a bit late, so perfectly fine.
Thank you for a really interesting talk.
Thank you.
We've been doing some studies on game jamming as well, and many of these things resonated. One thing that I find interesting is that you mentioned that game jams are non-competitive, and we found that there are also very competitive game jamming cultures. So
yeah.
I feel that sort of do address that culture is a really important thing, and of course one thing that you're doing here is you're building game jam culture when you're sort of teaching how these things are done.
I think only one of my participants had ever been to a game jam before. Yeah. So I've defined game jam for them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think that's something to keep in mind. But to expand on that, there's a few questions that I'd like to ask.
Yeah.
Were people allowed to help other teams?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was one instance where kind of a large friendship group had formed 2 teams because I wouldn't let them all work together, but they were just constantly kind of backwards and forwards. And what I wanted to achieve and what generally happened was teams and then sort of a meta team that was everybody, because I wanted the feedback from everybody. So yeah. So the competitive game jams that you're talking, is that game jams that are set up to be competitive, or just game jams attended by very competitive people?
Both. And it feels like they're feeding into each other. Mostly we've seen them, I think, in Denmark and UK.
Right. Okay.
In Finland, there's a number of people who have put in significant effort to make them less competitive.
Oh wow. Okay. I didn't see any of that whatsoever.
Yeah. So, and I know that in Finland there are jams. People sometimes go and they make music for all of the games at the jam. So they're part of the same team. Okay. Were tasks gendered? This is something we see a lot in digital game jams, that even though participation might be fairly equal, there is a tendency that sort of the techie stuff is often male-coded, whereas, for example, the art stuff is female-coded. I'm just wondering, did you see any sort of gendered tasks?
We dodged all the techie stuff by it being analog.
Yeah.
I can't think of any examples where that was prevalent. The way that you could tell the difference between the participants was if they were a gamer or not. So generally a gamer would kind of go, right, and now we're going to do this, and they kind of naturally sort of project manage a group, but a group without an experienced gamer tended to be more egalitarian. But I don't think there was any particular genderedness, but I'm assuming that the game jams that you're talking about didn't have nearly such a balanced gender split. Okay.
Yeah. 2 more short questions.
That's okay.
Why the same theme every time? Is that like a research purpose, or because I would think that if you're doing them in the same school, people might know what the theme is going to be.
So there were 3 in one school and 2 in another. No, sorry, there was 4 in one, but there was no overlap between the participants at all. So the ones that I ran with the foundation students, that was in subsequent year cohorts, and the same with the product designers. And then the other 2 just drew from different sets of people. The reason I stuck with the theme was because it worked, really, mainly, but also if I wanted to kind of hold these things together, then I didn't want to change too many things between the game jams, because it might be if I changed the theme from bugs to anti-Semitism, then I might see really different data because people were taking it more seriously or something like that, perhaps.
Final question: were the games published?
Nope. No, I think that's a downside to analog games, because you can just put it on itch.io when you're finished, and then it can be a thing. Whereas I'm having people wander off with a little bag with 6 meeples and 3 dice and a board. So I'm not seeing it, like, from my perspective, it's not about making the games. I don't know, I sort of don't care what happens to the games afterwards, but I'm sure that the point is making the games for a lot of the participants that you were dealing with.
Thank you.
No, you're welcome.
Okay, next question.
Thank you. How much do you think that your data is contingent on the analog nature of the games made? Like, do you think you might have gotten different results if you had hosted a digital game jam instead?
I think I probably would have seen quite significantly different results, but I think that that's because making it a digital game jam selects for a particular cohort of people, whereas I was able to deliver it quite generally. Mine were also all sort of voluntary. If I ran it with a class, some of whom didn't want to participate, then I can see a dilution of the effect, perhaps. Or it might actually work better if I forced people to be there. But yeah, I think that's sort of the main difference there.
Thank you.
Okay, more questions?
Thank you. Well, first of all, the most important question, what would happen if the Moomin ended up in the same rectangle with one of those other characters?
It happens. One thing that maybe nobody noticed as well, at this one, the Moomin's wearing a top hat. So, so yeah, no, I think what would happen is that they'd just make friends, because I don't think Moomins are fundamentally an aggressive, unpleasant creature, and meeples are literally ciphers for the people playing them. So if you're a horrible player and then you're in the same square as a Moomin, then maybe you can misbehave with it.
Okay, I got another one, which is more sort of like a practical question. Can you get back to the sort of like the data collection slide?
Oh, I've got quite a lot of slides, haven't I? This one?
Yes, this works perfectly. So what I'm seeing here is like there are sort of like several phases in which observation and photos are mentioned.
Yes.
So how do you organize your notes and data if this is actually the case?
So with the observations, which weren't right, the alarm's gone off, take an observation, it was, oh, something interesting's happened. I printed out sheets with sort of a box to put the initials of the group and the time that I'd taken it, and obviously the game jam that it was in, and basically just handwrit those, hopefully in chronological order, but I kind of time-stamped them. And then laboriously went across later and tried to interpret my handwriting, most of which I managed to do. So that seemed to work fairly well, but it was quite troublesome because when a lot was going on, there were definitely instances where 3 interesting things were happening at once, and then I was trying to write them down, but then somebody would ask me a question. So
Right. Yeah. I'm just sort of like really curious because that sounds like a fairly sound system, or that you sort of need to have some sort of system because you're sort of like interested in learning sort of like what may be the sort of like the effect or what may be the learning, and then you sort of like need to have a pretty good idea that okay, what happened here and what maybe came after that.
So like I mentioned that there's a mention of a snapshot there. So those were like really like 3-question surveys for people to complete on their phone to try and kind of assess how happy people were with the games, how happy they were with their group, and there was one other, and I collected those maybe 10 times for the first couple, but I hadn't quite worked out how to process that data to be useful, and it was quite disruptive. One thing I definitely would recommend, and probably everybody else has worked this out, that like a Microsoft Forms or a Google Docs with a big QR code on the presentation is an absolutely effortless way to get people to fill things in. I think that was definitely an easy win. And it meant that everything was in Excel at the back end as well, so I didn't have to pass any participants' handwriting, which obviously is not always straightforward.
Okay, I will ask the last question and then we're out of time. So
Yeah.
I was wondering, because you were mentioning that this type of game jamming doesn't require skills like digital games one would.
Yeah.
So have you sort of dropped this teaching method? Have you dropped this on somebody who's kind of like not suspecting it, like hello students, today we're gonna have a game jam, and like off you go?
Not deliberately, but I think I had 3 participants. So the Salford ones I ran in a mid-term reading week, where the staff are around, the students can come in if they want, but there's no formal teaching. I had, I think, 3 participants who just sort of stumbled in because they hadn't realised they didn't need to, and then they joined in. So they were the ones who completely didn't know it was happening, and 2 of them stayed and really got into it, and 1 kind of made excuses towards the end of the first day and sneaked off. Kind of as a different, when you were starting to ask the question, it also made me think about the fact that I know how to make analog games, and my expertise as a facilitator will play into all of this. And sort of further research that I think probably needs to be done is somebody who does, like an art design lecturer runs this, but they haven't played hundreds of different games, they haven't designed their own games. And whether the whole thing falls apart because you just end up with 12 versions of Snakes and Ladders and 6 versions of Monopoly is, yeah, that's something that sort of concerns me. So, yeah, hopefully we'll see eventually.
Okay, thank you so much for the presentation. One last round of applause.
Also, I think thank you for hosting me and giving me a nicer desk than Manchester have. So